All right, so let's jump in. All about plastics. As you may know, the Earth Day 2024 theme was plastics versus planet. Plastics are everywhere. They are in our blood. They're in the bottom of the ocean. Plastic pollution is really reaching nightmare proportions, and most people are in agreement that this isn't the type of world that we want to live in. So this theme, Plastics versus Planet, was intended to highlight the work being done by the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, which is actually happening almost literally as we speak. So I'm going to come back to that, but that's the background for the theme this year. So the goal for this is to reduce plastic production 60% by 2040. So we're going to talk a little bit more about numbers here. And so it's also not just reducing plastic production, but eliminating plastic pollution by implementing more circular economy methods. So let's talk about those numbers. Plastics obviously have brought a lot of value to our life, but they've also brought tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of volume. So in 2022, roughly 400 million tons of plastic was produced globally. Every minute, the world population uses roughly 1 million plastic bottles. Petrochemicals, which plastics is the biggest type of petrochemicals, but also other things like paint. But petrochemicals account for 14% of global oil demand. The plastic industry accounts for 5% of global carbon emissions, and that could grow to 20% of global emissions by 2050 if current trends continue. Plastic production is expected to nearly triple from 2020 to 2060. So, basically in the 1940s and 50s, we went from almost no plastic to 400 million tons. And then by 2060, we could be looking at upwards of 1,200 million tons of plastic. So if you think it's bad now, yeah, it really shows that we need urgency to act on this issue. Also, roughly half of all plastics are intended as single-use plastics. So with how pervasive plastics have become, could you honestly imagine a world without plastics? I couldn't. I actually don't know if I would want to live in that world. Plastics do, afford us a lot of things that bring us healthier lives in general, but responsible management of plastics is really what we need to focus on next. So what are plastics? Plastics are petrochemicals, as I said earlier, which is essentially the feedstocks are oil and gas. So plastics are solid forms of oil and gas. You can think of it that way. Colorants, stabilizers, and other additives are added to these plastics to give them unique qualities. Those plastics are lumped together in buckets and given resin codes. So the resin codes is the numbers that you see on these plastics. I'm going to go through these resin codes. Hey, Nicole, I'm just reading your chat. Logistics industry. Great. Collect and reuse all our plastic waste. That's definitely a theme. I'd love to circle back at the end for trends, and feel free to jump on later and jump into the conversation. So back to the plastic codes. All right. Number 1 is PET, polyethylene terephthalate. This is by far the most common type of plastic. As I said before about the single-use plastics, a lot of this plastics is going to be polyethylene. PET also comes in different forms, so high density and low density polyethylene, which is 2 and 4, respectively. We also have polyvinyl chloride. We have polypropylene, which is plastics number 5. We have number 6, which is polystyrene, and then EPS, or expanded polystyrene, is what we know as styrofoam. And then we have 7, which is basically just everything else, kind of a miscellaneous category. So each of these plastics has different chemical and physical properties. Effective recycling starts with sorting these plastics because they really each need different treatments because of those properties. As for the recycling symbol, it's basically a massive greenwashing propaganda scheme by the oil and gas industry. You really need to check to see what facilities are available to you locally before you can just throw any piece of plastic in the recycling bin. Even some of these plastics can't actually even be recycled at all. So, for example, I just learned that my nearest foam collection center, for example, styrofoam, was over 1 hour away. So if I wanted to toss styrofoam, I'd have to drive an hour to do that properly. Not really going to happen. Significant quantities of non-recyclable materials in general, not just plastics, can contaminate a load of recycling. So it's really best to follow the rule: when in doubt, throw it out. But also your local municipality will have guidance on what can and can't be recycled. And then, of course, if you're working for a business, you may be able to find special vendors to take certain plastics, which I will also talk about in the trends section. So speaking of throwing plastics out, just how much are we talking about here? Well, plastics, so these are numbers from the US and the UK, 2018, which is the last year available that I could find. Plastics make up roughly 10 to 12% of the total municipal solid waste streams by weight. Other top categories are food, paper, things like that, glass. These are fairly easy to recycle or compost, but of course, effective recycling, the most economical way to do that is to sort these materials correctly at the point of waste generation. So better recycling and less plastic in general will make a significant impact in the total amount of waste that we have to generate, or that we generate and have to process. So now that we've talked a little bit about plastics, gotten a little bit more background about their unique characteristics, let's talk about recycling plastics. So, of course, the goal of recycling is to reduce waste sent to the landfill and extend the life of raw materials, because we do live on a finite planet after all. This concept is referred to as the circular economy, which I'm sure you all have heard about before. I actually don't like saying circular economy because we'll never actually, it's impossible to achieve a 100% recycling rate. I like to say move towards a more circular economy. That's just me, because it's a limitation of physics, but also economics. So right now it's much, much cheaper to send things to the landfill than it is to recycle them, most things at least. So especially with plastics, you know, they're very cheap to buy, and there's just so much plastic out there that logistically we literally cannot capture it all, and it ends up in rivers and then the oceans and everywhere else. So this is some of the reasons why only 9% of plastics ever made have been recycled. So what does recycling plastic actually look like? So we're going to start at the top here at the star. So as I said, plastics are basically solid forms of oil and gas. So you're starting with that fossil-based feedstock 98% of the time. There are bio-based plastics out there. So the plastics go through a process called polymerization. So this is basically where polymers of carbon are formed, and that kind of creates the strength that we see in plastics. You're going to actually produce a different type of plastic, whatever kind of plastics that you want. You're going to add colorants, stabilizers. Maybe you're gluing multiple types of plastic together for certain materials. And then that plastic, you know, there is pre-consumer waste, and there's also post-consumer waste. So once that plastic is used and discarded, It gets collected and sorted. That is typically called a materials recovery facility. So when you throw out plastics into your trash truck, that gets picked up, taken to a materials recovery facility, sorted, and then sent out to the landfill. Or especially in Europe, they do a lot of incineration. So this could be with or without energy recovery, but that's a very common method of disposal. Then we also have the actual recycling of the plastic. So this comes in two forms. This could be chemical recycling or also mechanical recycling. So chemical recycling is still a fairly new process. Mechanical recycling has been around for a while. These may be new terms for you, so I'm going to dive into them in the next slide. But basically, the recycling of plastics here creates a byproduct that can be sold to create new products or recycled back into a refinery. So with mechanical recycling, plastics of a certain quality, you can mix some plastics with mechanical recycling, but not only certain types of plastics can be mixed together. So in this case, plastics are lightly heated. They're cleaned, lightly heated, they're melted and extruded. And they are either, you may see pellets like this at the top, or maybe even flakes. And those flakes may be spun into fibers for clothing or carpet, stuff like that. So it's a sellable byproduct. As for chemical recycling, this is where you use a chemical process to break those polymer bonds back into monomers. So you're either doing high heat or other chemical reactions to break those plastics down back into oil and gas. So in theory, this is the quote most circular solution because ideally you're starting out with that fresh oil and gas, although there's other pollutants that come out of the process, and it is very energy intensive as well. But what we're actually seeing with chemical recycling is that this oil and gas is actually offsetting fuel use for refineries. It's not actually reducing the need for reducing virgin plastics. So basically, the oil and gas industry is using this to offset their own costs while continuing to perpetuate the plastics problem. Also, one con of mechanical recycling is that plastics can only be recycled so many times. So every time it goes through that heating and extrusion process, the grade of plastic decreases ever so slightly. And so there is a limitation to just how many times any certain plastic can be recycled as well. So, in theory, we're working towards circularity, but I'll get to the reason why recycling obviously can't be our only option here. So I would be remiss if I did not talk about bio-based plastics and do a little myth busting. So if maybe you have seen this very product at an event, we're starting to see more of these bio-based, compostable, biodegradable plastic cups at events, at least I am. The bottom picture is actually at an event that I recently attended at a climate summit, no less. But you can see that these cups were thrown in the recycling bin. This is a big no-no. These plastics cannot be recycled in the same way that oil and gas-based plastics. They essentially contaminate the load of recycling, and then in that case, the whole load just gets thrown in the trash. The other thing is, they're labeled as compostable, but these products won't compost in the landfill either. It's just the properties of a landfill. It's an anaerobic environment. Things don't compost. They can degrade, but basically you're likely spending extra money to buy these products thinking that you're doing good, but it's really just, it's the same issue. And these are actually more energy intensive and resource intensive to manufacture. and you're still just getting those sent to the landfill. Now, if you do have a composting stream available to you, by all means, use these products. But I just had to let folks know that these are not actually recyclable and you must compost them in order to get the benefits from buying them. So we've gone over plastics, we've gone over recycling, some of the ins and outs of all of those. We realize that this is an issue. There's no silver bullet here. So what is going on in the industry in the future, in the near future, and what are governments doing about it? So unfortunately, due to decades of lobbying by oil and gas companies, government handouts have made plastics incredibly cheap, incredibly pervasive, allowing them to really, take over a lot of different uses in our society that we didn't ever need or see before. At the same time, these companies have made the individual feel like they are responsible for recycling more and shouldering the crushing weight of the plastics problem. So it's not that I don't believe one person can't make an impact, but relying on the individual is really not enough at this point, just due to some of these numbers that we've seen. And especially as the world transitions from, fossil fuels to renewable energy, you can bet that these companies are doing everything that they can to expand plastics as an area of revenue. So this graph on the right echoes the earlier estimate that plastics demand is set to nearly triple by 2050. And it's, plastics and petrochemicals are actually set to be roughly a third of new oil growth demand. And that number will increase to half by 2050. So plastics are going to be using more oil than trucks, aviation, and shipping. So where plastics aren't going anywhere, but where are they going? So even the US, we used to send 70% of our plastics to China. Then in 2018, China enacted a very strict import policy where only the cleanest of plastics could be imported. They basically stopped accepting our waste. So that was a very small percentage that they were still accepting. And so this led to our plastics being diverted to other Southeastern Asian countries, and they are now banning imports of plastics because it's just so much. So this ban also led to an increase in overall recycling costs. It led to an increase in incineration, both legal and illegal incineration. However, it also did spur some investment in recycling facilities and technologies that we clearly need. So while recycling is becoming more advanced, governments are realizing that recycling isn't a panacea for our plastics addiction. We drastically need to reduce the total amount of plastics that we use. There's a reason why reduce comes first in reduce, reuse, recycle. So as I mentioned before, nearly 50% of plastics are being manufactured with the intent of single use. So this is an obvious starting point to reduce total number of plastics. Local and federal governments who are unfairly burdened with the logistical nightmare of waste management, they're starting to ban single-use plastics. This includes silverware, takeout containers, grocery bags, and yes, straws. Even China has a 5-year plan to phase out single-use plastics. In this chart, you can see the red is a full all-out ban. The striped red is like a partial ban. So some states may have it, but it's not a countrywide ban. And you can see different types of single-use plastics here that are most commonly getting banned. My town in Maryland actually just recently banned the grocery bags, plastic. So everyone's got to bring their own now. And everybody's getting used to that, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So this is really managing plastics towards the end of their life, but we also need to start driving accountability up the supply chain. So this is where extended supplier responsibility comes in, or ESR legislation. So as we move towards a more circular economy, we need materials to replace those plastics, and we need them to be easily recyclable. So that to ensure we're designing with recycling in mind and making unsustainability more expensive, this extended supplier responsibility legislation is starting to charge producers of plastics, or not just plastics, but you can see also paper to car tires, kind of plastics, but batteries, these types of products, to make it more expensive to dispose of them, or at least, they're having to take more responsibility with things like take back schemes, for example. They're fining them for using certain materials, banning certain, single-use type stuff, as we've seen. And they're also encouraging more sustainable product design. So sustainable product design starts with, ethical and available raw materials. It means efficient manufacturing and distribution, user-centered, simpler designs, and also consideration for reuse, repair, and recyclability. So that's another bills are getting introduced. In Europe, they're a little further ahead than in the US, but certain states are definitely pursuing extended supplier responsibility legislation. Okay, lastly, to circle back to my very first point about the Global Plastics Treaty, did you know that just 2 years ago, over 150 nations agreed to do their best to come to some arrangement to end plastic pollution by 2040. So their goal is to come to an agreement by the end of this year. So literally just last week, representatives were meeting in Ottawa, Canada, to discuss some of the options here. Now, countries where their main economic income is relying on exports of oil and gas, they're as usual kind of delaying negotiations. But the last that I was reading, things were moving in the right direction. It's really, I love this because it's a very fast-paced goal. By 2024, they hope to have an agreement in place. So how exciting would that be if we could get some movement? And this is actually going to be the biggest climate type legislation, if it gets passed, since the Paris Agreement in 2015. So definitely keep your eyes on this one. All right, so in conclusion, what are you to do with this information? Well, I just hope you learned something new. Learning is very crucial, especially in sustainability. Things are moving so quickly. New technologies, new things popping up all the time. So it's good to stay informed. However, what can you do? What can you do at your workplace or in your home? Well, of course, you can look around and do your best to reduce single-use plastic use. Depending on your workplace or packaging, work with your suppliers to see what kind of solutions you could come up with. Composting. So recently in my town, well, not so recently, but a few years back, an entrepreneurial individual decided to start a composting company. And now businesses and residents are composting. And actually my compost bin, a 5-gallon bucket, just got dropped off right on my doorstep this morning. So this may be a waste stream that wasn't previously available to you in your region, but now is. So there was a large federal grant for composting programs. I think it was $50 million that trickled down to states, and they're getting composting going. So if you haven't looked up if composting is available in your region lately, do it now. Or you could always compost at home if you have that luxury. So some of the more difficult plastics, I used to work in the biotech industry. We had medical waste plastics. We had very complex a lot of different types of plastics that we used, or considered hazardous due to different chemicals they were housing or whatever. We actually used triumvirate as one of our waste management services. So they collected our medical and hazardous waste plastics and turned it into that plastic lumber. So that would be mechanical recycling. Also TerraCycle, especially those really random, like one-off type of products that may not normally be recycled in your municipality, but like they collect cigarette butts, they collect the antimicrobial wipes, they collect coffee pods, they collect candy bar wrappers. And so they actually do a mix of chemical and mechanical recycling depending on the product, but their business model is taking these random items and turning them into something new. So that's another option. And the last I checked, TerraCycle was available in many countries, actually. So that's exciting. And then there's other specialty vendors. I remember one of my sites was able to find a vendor locally who took our polystyrene, and turned it into burned it, turned it into ash, and then added it to cement. So you never know until you ask around, but these are certain ways that your business can further reduce its waste to landfill numbers and increase total recycling rate. All right, so that's it for today. I would love it if you would stay in touch with myself and/or SustainabilitE Solutions. I did want to let you all know that I do have a special offer for small businesses and nonprofits for a $250 sustainability consultation. And this is done virtually, or if you're in Maryland or in the DMV region, I could come to you. But I just ask about your processes, talk about waste, but also energy, greenhouse gas emissions, water, and kind of set you in the right foot in starting to tackle some of these. If you are not a business owner, or maybe you have a group that you work with, or you're just responsible for an area, I do have a virtual Sustainability 101 training that goes over this, plus a lot more. And that's 2 to 3 hours, can be tailored to your industry, but that's also available. So please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, SustainabilitE Solutions. And then I'm going to close out the presentation. I'm going to post the review form link in the chat, and I would love to hear from my participants what you thought anonymously in the form, or if you have any questions, I would be glad to take them now. So thanks so much.